What do you do when three of your most powerful warships are suddenly hit from three directions at once? Missiles from the coast, drones from above, and speedboats charging in from the water, all at the same time. That is not a training scenario. That is exactly what happened to the United States Navy in the Strait of Hormuz. And the American answer was so fast, so complete, and so overwhelming that not a single Iranian weapon found its mark. If you want the real story, what actually happened, which ships were involved, what weapons Iran used, and what the US did about it in the hours that followed, stay right here. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with one person who needs to understand what is happening in the Persian Gulf right now. You will not get this level of detail anywhere else. Let's get into it. To understand why this attack happened at all, you have to go back to February 28th, 2026. That is the day the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a joint military campaign targeting Iranian military infrastructure. Iran's response was immediate and dramatic. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps transmitted warnings over VHF radio to every ship in the Strait of Hormuz. The message was direct. No foreign vessel was permitted to pass. The strait was closed. That closure was not symbolic. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical choke points in the entire global economy. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through that narrow passage every single day. 1/5 of its liquefied natural gas exports travel the same route. When Iran shut it down, it did not just create a regional problem. It sent shockwaves through global energy markets overnight. Shipping companies responded the only way they could. Many vessels simply turned back or stayed in port rather than risk the crossing. Thousands of ships ended up trapped inside the Persian Gulf with nowhere to go. The British Royal Navy made clear that the closure carried no legal force under international maritime law, but legality and safety are two different things. And with the IRGC actively patrolling those waters and making its intentions explicit, safety could not be guaranteed, so traffic stopped. Now think about the geography of this problem for a moment, because the physical shape of the Strait of Hormuz is the reason a relatively small military force can hold the entire world's energy supply hostage. At its narrowest point, the strait measures only about 21 miles wide. The actual navigable shipping lanes, the channels deep enough and clear enough for large commercial vessels, narrow down to roughly 2 miles in each direction on either side of an internationally recognized separation zone. 2 miles. Every supertanker, every container ship, every oil carrier moving energy out of the Persian Gulf has to squeeze through that same 2-mile corridor. And that corridor runs so close to the Iranian coastline that shore-based missile batteries, mobile launchers, and IRGC patrol boats can threaten every passing ship without ever venturing far from home waters. This is not a wide-open ocean where warships can spread out, maneuver freely, and absorb incoming fire from multiple angles. This is a thread needle inside a shooting gallery with one side of the gallery lined by decades of Iranian weapon systems specifically designed to exploit that geography. By mid-April 2026, a ceasefire had been reached between the United States and Iran. It took effect on April 12th, but a ceasefire on paper and an actual return to safe navigation are not the same thing. With roughly 2,000 ships still trapped inside the Gulf and thousands of civilian crew members unable to move, the situation demanded more than a diplomatic agreement. It demanded action. The Trump administration launched a dedicated military operation called Project Freedom. The mission was specific: break Iran's physical grip on the strait and escort commercial vessels through it under U.S. Navy protection. American warships would go in, guide merchant shipping through the contested passage, and defend that transit against any interference. This is the operation that put 3 American destroyers directly in the crosshairs of the IRGC Navy on May 7th, 2026. But before we get to that day, it is important to understand the first warning shot, because May 7th did not come out of nowhere. On May 4th, 2026, Iran moved first. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper, in a briefing to reporters, confirmed that Iranian forces had launched multiple cruise missiles, drones, and small attack boats at commercial ships transiting the strait. In some cases, those attacks were directed at U.S. Navy vessels as well. American forces responded immediately. Apache and Seahawk helicopters were deployed and sank 6 Iranian attack boats that morning. Iranian state media claimed that missiles had struck a U.S. Navy destroyer. Admiral Cooper's response was plain and direct: no American vessels were hit. That gap between Iranian state media claims and what CENTCOM actually confirmed is a pattern that will repeat itself throughout this entire story. Remember it, because every time Iran claimed a victory in these waters, the confirmed record told a different story. Now, here's the part that matters most for understanding Iran's strategy. What the IRGC did on May 4th, and what it escalated 3 days later, was not improvised. The IRGC Navy has spent nearly 4 decades building a specific naval doctrine designed around one core concept: overwhelm a technologically superior Navy, not by matching it ship for ship, but by flooding it with more simultaneous threats than it can physically engage at once. Iran has practiced this approach in exercises with names like Iqtidar and Great Prophet. Large-scale simulations involving swarms of small, fast attack boats, shore-launched anti-ship missiles, and waves of drones all converging on a target, simultaneously from different directions at different speeds with different flight profiles. The entire point is to force a defending warship into an impossible prioritization problem. You cannot intercept everything at once if enough things arrive at once. That is the theory. May 7th was the first time this doctrine was executed in an actual shooting war against live American warships. Not a training exercise, not a simulation, but a real coordinated attack on 3 real ships transiting a real strait. 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers were moving through the Strait of Hormuz that morning as part of Project Freedom. The USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, the USS Mason. According to CENTCOM's own statement, Iranian forces launched multiple missiles, drones, and small attack boats simultaneously at all 3 ships during that transit. Pause on what that coordination actually required. Someone in the IRGC command structure had to track the position and movement of 3 separate destroyers as they transited the strait. That tracking data had to be correlated with the positions of available missile batteries on the coastline, drone units in the area, and fast attack boat squadrons on the water. Launch sequences had to be timed so that missiles, drones, and boats all converged on their targets at roughly the same moment, not arriving one by one to be picked off individually, but hitting in overlapping waves designed to saturate the defenders. And all of those firing orders had to travel down the command chain fast enough that American radar systems did not have time to build a complete threat picture before the attack was already underway. This was a synchronized multi-domain strike. Air, surface, and subsurface threats converging on 3 separate American warships at the same time in a narrow waterway with limited room to maneuver. Every single one of those attacks failed. Not one American vessel was hit. CENTCOM's statement was unambiguous. U.S. forces intercepted the unprovoked Iranian attacks and responded with self-defense strikes. The command confirmed explicitly that no American ship sustained damage during the engagement. Before we get into exactly how that happened and what the American retaliation looked like, drop a comment right now. Tell me, do you think Iran's swarming doctrine is a genuine long-term threat to American naval power? Or did May 7th prove that the technology gap is simply too wide for that strategy to ever work? I read every single comment. Subscribe while you're there, hit the bell, and let's keep going, because the story of how 3 destroyers defeated that attack and what the Navy hit in response is where this gets genuinely remarkable. The defensive performance on May 7th was built on a system that Arleigh Burke-class destroyers are specifically designed around, the Aegis combat system. Aegis is not a single weapon. It is an integrated network. Radar, computers, missile launchers, and point defense systems, all working together to maintain a continuous, real-time picture of every potential threat in the surrounding airspace and water while cueing the ship's defensive weapons onto the most dangerous threats first. The SPY radar array at the heart of the Aegis system can track dozens of separate targets simultaneously, not one at a time, all of them at once. That is the specific capability that makes a saturation attack so difficult to execute successfully against a well-prepared Aegis-equipped ship. Here is what a layered defense on a destroyer like these actually looks like in practice. At the outer layer, interceptor missiles engage incoming threats at range, destroying an inbound missile or drone well before it gets close enough to cause direct damage. If something leaks through that outer layer, close-in weapon systems take over. These are radar-guided rotary cannons mounted directly on the ship. They fire at extraordinarily high rates and are designed to shred an incoming threat in the final seconds before impact. Running in parallel with all of this, electronic warfare systems are constantly working to jam or spoof the guidance systems on incoming missiles and drones, trying to make them lose their targeting lock on the ship entirely before the interceptors even have to engage. And against small boats specifically, a destroyer's own deck guns and embarked helicopters provide a separate close-range engagement option that operates independently of the air defense systems. 3 destroyers moving together means 3 overlapping sets of all of these systems, each covering the blind spots of the ships beside it. That layered, overlapping coverage across 3 hulls is precisely why a coordinated attack combining missiles, drones, and small boats, exactly the combination Iran deployed, still produced 0 hits. The USS Mason, hull number DDG-87, is worth noting specifically. It is one of the most combat-tested destroyers in the current U.S. Navy inventory when it comes to defending against exactly this type of threat. The Mason had previously been involved in intercepting missile threats during earlier regional conflicts. It had operated under fire before. The Truxtun and Rafael Peralta brought the same Aegis architecture, giving the three-ship formation overlapping radar coverage and layered interceptor capability from three independent firing platforms working in coordination. Iran used a wide range of weapons in this attack. Its short-range anti-ship cruise missiles, and from the Nasser and Nasir families, are mounted on fast attack boats and designed for close-in strikes in exactly the kind of narrow, confined space the Strait of Hormuz represents. Behind those, Iran also fields longer-range sea-skimming missiles like the Noor, Qadr, and Qadr families, with reported ranges extending past 300 kilometers, allowing coastal batteries positioned well back from the immediate shipping channel to still threaten vessels transiting through it. Add waves of small, explosive-laden drones and fast attack boats capable of speeds exceeding 100 kilometers per hour, and you have a genuinely layered threat package arriving on different flight profiles at different speeds, with different radar signatures, all simultaneously. Sorting through that in real time is exactly the problem Aegis was built to solve. It solved it completely on May 7th. A multi-domain Iranian attack against 3 American warships in the most contested stretch of water on the planet produced 0 hits and 0 American casualties. The American retaliation came within hours. CENTCOM launched strikes against Iranian missile and drone launch sites, command and control facilities, and intelligence and surveillance hubs. The targets stretched from the southern Iranian coastline all the way to Tehran itself. That last detail is significant. This was not a narrow tactical response aimed only at the specific coastal batteries that had just fired. It was a broader strike package aimed at the command infrastructure and intelligence gathering capability that made the coordinated May 7th attack possible in the first place. Think about what that means strategically. To pull off a synchronized 3-destroyer attack, Iran needed tracking systems monitoring ship movements, command networks coordinating between missile batteries, drone units and boat squadrons, and intelligence infrastructure confirming target positions in real time. CENTCOM did not just destroy the launch sites, it targeted the nodes that made the launch possible. The goal was not just punishment for what already happened. It was dismantling Iran's ability to organize another attack like it. That is a different kind of retaliation than simply striking back at whatever fired last. It is targeting the architecture of the threat itself. Here is a number that puts the full scale of what was happening in this region into perspective. 427. That is the number of American service members wounded in Operation Epic Fury, as of Stars and Stripes reporting in late July 2026. Not killed, wounded. People who will carry blast injuries, burns, shrapnel wounds, and traumatic brain injuries for the rest of their lives, alongside 17 confirmed American deaths in 5 months of conflict. That human cost gives you the full weight of what Project Freedom was operating inside. Not a controlled peacetime exercise, but an active shooting war with real casualties accumulating in real time. The United Arab Emirates alone confirmed intercepting and destroying 537 ballistic missiles, more than 2,250 drone attacks, and 26 cruise missiles fired from Iran over the course of this conflict. Kuwait's official tally reached 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones shot down over a base hosting more than 13,000 American service members. Those numbers tell you that May 7th was not an isolated, unusual event. It was one engagement inside a sustained region-wide campaign of Iranian missile and drone activity being thrown at American and Allied forces across multiple countries simultaneously, week after week throughout the spring of 2026. 3 destroyers defeating one coordinated attack without a single hit is impressive on its own terms. It is genuinely more impressive once you understand it happened inside a broader air and missile defense effort that was fielding thousands of incoming threats across the entire region during the same general period. The engagement also hit civilian lives in ways that rarely make headlines. The day before the destroyer attack, May 6th, the French shipping giant CMA-CGM confirmed that its Malta-flagged container ship, the San Antonio, was struck while transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Multiple crew members were injured. The vessel sustained damage. That is a reminder that this was not a clean military versus military confrontation happening in a controlled environment. It was unfolding in the middle of an active civilian shipping lane. Ordinary merchant crews on vessels with no weapons, no Aegis systems, and no military training were caught in the crossfire of a war they had no part in. Thousands of sailors remained trapped inside the Gulf region for weeks as the fighting continued, caught between a closed strait, an active naval blockade, and periodic outbreaks of missile and drone fire. Their story is the less discussed side of a conflict that is usually told through destroyer names and interception statistics. The day after the destroyer attack, May 8th, the United States escalated against Iranian maritime trade. A U.S. Navy F/A-18 Super Hornet launched from the USS George H.W. Bush fired precision munitions at the smokestacks of 2 Iranian-flagged oil tankers attempting to transit toward an Iranian port in direct violation of the U.S. naval blockade in place since mid-April. Striking a tanker's smokestack rather than its hull or cargo area is a deliberate, calibrated targeting choice. It disables the vessel's propulsion, forcing it to stop without creating a catastrophic hull breach or environmental disaster from a cargo spill. That targeting decision says something specific about intent. This was not an attempt to sink Iranian ships. It was an attempt to enforce a blockade with minimum collateral damage, while sending an unmistakable message about the cost of violation. That blockade enforcement continued. A U.S. Navy FA-18 Super Hornet later fired 20mm cannon rounds at the tanker MT Hasna after the vessel ignored repeated warnings while attempting a similar transit. A nearly identical interdiction had occurred in April involving the Iranian-flagged MV Tasa. Even as missile and drone exchanges dominated the headlines, the naval blockade never paused. It kept operating in the background of every other escalation, every day, without interruption. Now here is the moment for you to do something important. And I mean this genuinely. If you have watched this far and you're getting the real documented sequence behind this confrontation, the ships, the weapons, the CENTCOM statements, the strategic logic on both sides, then share this video right now. Not because it helps the algorithm, because the people in this story, the sailors on those 3 destroyers, the merchant crews caught in the crossfire, the 427 wounded Americans, they deserve more than a dramatic headline with nothing behind it. Share it. Then keep watching. Because the strategic debate about what May 7th actually proved is where this gets genuinely complicated. 3 weeks after the destroyer engagement, on May 25th, 2026, CENTCOM announced another round of self-defense strikes in southern Iran, this time targeting 2 IRGC boats caught in the act of laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz and a surface-to-air missile site near Bandar Abbas that CENTCOM said had been targeting American aircraft. CENTCOM spokesperson Captain Tim Hawkins stated that the strikes were carried out to protect American troops from threats posed by Iranian forces. He added a notably measured line for a military spokesperson operating in an active conflict, that CENTCOM continued to defend American forces while using restraint during the ongoing ceasefire. Iranian state media, through Fars news agency, claimed in response that an American MQ-9 Reaper drone had been shot down and that Iranian air defenses had also fired at a second MQ-9 and an F-35 Lightning II. CENTCOM did not comment on those specific claims. The same pattern of divergent narratives that ran through May 4th and May 7th continued unchanged. The Bandar Abbas surface-to-air missile site is worth understanding as its own category of target. Bandar Abbas sits directly across from Iran's own naval assets and has historically functioned as one of the IRGC Navy's primary operational hubs. A SAM site positioned there is not purely defensive. It is specifically capable of threatening American reconnaissance and strike aircraft operating over the strait and the surrounding approaches. CENTCOM's decision to strike that site directly, on top of the 2 mine-laying boats caught in the act, signals that the self-defense justification being invoked throughout this stretch of the conflict was not limited to responding only after an attack had already been launched. It extended to preemptively degrading Iranian systems identified as active ongoing threats to American aircraft operating in the area. All of this military activity was unfolding against a specific diplomatic backdrop that makes the continued willingness to fight even more striking. According to Military Times, the Trump administration was actively working during this exact period to negotiate a broader peace deal, including a 60-day extension of the ceasefire, a full stop to military activity on both sides, and a commitment from Iran to end its nuclear program entirely. In other words, missiles and drones were being launched at American destroyers, and American FA-18s were disabling Iranian tankers with cannon fire at the exact same time. American diplomats were trying to negotiate a ceasefire extension that both governments kept publicly accusing each other of violating. That is not a contradiction in the way it might first appear. It is how modern ceasefires frequently function in practice. Military pressure and diplomatic negotiation run on parallel tracks. Each side uses continued combat operations as leverage for whatever terms it is trying to secure at the table. Iran, still, subject to a naval blockade that had cut off its ports since mid-April, had every incentive to keep demonstrating that it could impose real costs and real risk on American shipping operations, specifically to strengthen its position in any talks about how that blockade might eventually be eased or lifted. The United States had every incentive to demonstrate through engagements like May 7th that any Iranian attempt to contest American naval operations would be defeated decisively and answered immediately, reinforcing the message that continued resistance carried real cost. While producing no actual battlefield success for Iran, both governments were negotiating with words in Oman-mediated talks and negotiating with missiles and interceptors in the Strait simultaneously. Neither side showed much sign of treating those 2 tracks as contradictory. The history underneath this confrontation adds important weight to what happened on May 7th. In 1988, during the Iran-Iraq War, the United States and Iran fought a one-day naval battle in the Persian Gulf known as Operation Praying Mantis. It was launched after an American frigate struck an Iranian mine. That engagement, the largest surface naval battle the U.S. Navy had fought since World War II at the time, saw American forces sink or disable roughly half of Iran's operational fleet in a single day. Analysts at the Washington Institute have specifically traced Iran's modern swarming doctrine, the same doctrine on display in every May 2026 engagement, directly back to the lessons Iran drew from that defeat. Rather than rebuilding a conventional navy capable of standing toe-to-toe with American warships, Iran deliberately invested instead in a large, dispersed, low-cost, fast attack fleet specifically designed to exploit the geographic constraints of the Strait of Hormuz. May 7th was, in a very real sense, the live-fire test of a doctrine Iran has been building for nearly 4 decades, in direct response to one of its worst-ever naval defeats. Now here is the genuine strategic debate that May 7th opened, and it is worth sitting with because there is no clean answer. On one side of the argument, the flawless defensive outcome, 3 destroyers, a coordinated, simultaneous attack combining missiles, drones, and small boats, 0 hits. Under that reading, May 7th is powerful evidence that American naval technology has developed a reliable answer to exactly the swarming saturation-style attack that Iran's entire naval doctrine is built around. It demonstrates in real combat conditions, not a training exercise, that the strategy can be defeated even when Iran commits fully to a coordinated multi-domain strike. On the other side, a single successful defense does not tell you what happens if Iran manages to concentrate a significantly larger volume of fire. More missiles, more drones, more boats launched simultaneously from more directions against a smaller or more isolated formation with less overlapping radar coverage than 3 destroyers moving together. The difference between defeating one coordinated attack and defeating every future attack Iran might attempt is, in this view, a meaningful and still open question. There is also a resource exhaustion argument worth taking seriously. Every interceptor missile a destroyer fires to defeat an incoming threat is expensive. More importantly, it is finite. A ship can only carry so many rounds before it has to withdraw to rearm. If Iran's underlying goal is not necessarily to sink an American destroyer outright, but rather to force American ships to expend their limited interceptor inventories again and again across repeated engagements, then even a string of complete tactical defeats like May 4th, May 7th, and May 25th could function as a slow attrition strategy against the broader American naval presence, provided Iran can replace its own lost boats and missile batteries faster than the U.S. can restock its interceptor magazines. Whether that math actually favors Iran over a long enough timeline is precisely the kind of classified logistics question that does not appear in a CENTCOM press statement. But it is the calculation that naval planners on both sides are almost certainly running every time one of these engagements occurs. The coalition context matters here, too. American destroyers were not operating alone. Gulf allies, including the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, were running their own missile defense operations simultaneously, coordinating closely with American forces on shared radar pictures and intercept data. The intelligence and tracking picture feeding American commanders on May 7th was being built collaboratively across an entire regional defense network, not generated by 3 isolated destroyers working alone. That coalition dimension is easy to lose sight of when the story narrows to 3 specific ship names, but it is an important part of why the American response was as fast and as coordinated as it was. This confrontation also landed directly in Washington's political conversation almost immediately. Lawmakers tracking the conflict framed the May 7th attack as clear evidence of continued Iranian aggression even under a formal ceasefire, using it to argue for a sustained or expanded American military posture in the region, rather than any drawdown. That is a familiar pattern in how engagements like this get processed politically. An attack that produces 0 American casualties and a fully successful defense still tends to be treated as proof that the threat has not gone away, rather than as evidence that deterrence is working. Whether that reaction reflects genuine ongoing risk or the political incentive to appear strong on an active adversary depends entirely on where you stand. What is not in dispute, regardless of where you land on that debate, is the sheer frequency with which this cycle repeated itself throughout the spring of 2026. May 4th. Iran attacks commercial ships and Navy vessels. 6 small boats destroyed. May 7th. Iran launches a coordinated attack on 3 destroyers. 0 hits. U.S. retaliates against launch sites and command infrastructure. May 8th. U.S. disables 2 Iranian tankers violating the blockade. May 25th. U.S. strikes mine-laying boats in a SAM site in self-defense. 4 separate confirmed military engagements in roughly 3 weeks. all happening underneath a ceasefire that was supposed to have already ended major hostilities between the two countries back on April 12th. That gap between the formal diplomatic status of this conflict and the lived daily reality of ships firing on each other in the Strait of Hormuz is the central story here. And it is a gap that persisted for weeks, even as negotiators worked toward extending the very ceasefire being tested almost weekly on the water. Here is where things actually stand. Iran built a naval doctrine across 4 decades specifically to defeat American warships in this strait. It rehearsed that doctrine in exercises. It refined it. It waited for the moment when the geography, the political situation, and the operational picture aligned in its favor. On May 7, 2026, it executed that doctrine, for the first time in an actual shooting war, against 3 of the most capable surface combatants the U.S. Navy. Operates. It did not work, not even slightly. The Aegis combat system, the layered defensive architecture across 3 overlapping hulls, the Apache and Seahawk helicopters, the electronic warfare systems, and the combat-tested crews of the Truxtun, the Rafael Peralta, and the Mason, all of it worked together so completely that a synchronized multi-domain attack produced 0 hits and 0 American casualties. And within hours, the United States reached back through the chain of command that organized that attack and struck the infrastructure that made it possible, from the southern coastline all the way to Tehran. A single successful missile or drone hit against any one of those 3 destroyers, even a glancing strike far short of sinking a ship, would have represented the first direct Iranian hit on an American warship in this entire war. An outcome that almost certainly would have forced an immediate and dramatically larger American military response than the self-defense strikes CENTCOM actually carried out. The fact that this engagement resolved with 0 hits rather than becoming the spark for something far larger is not a small detail at the edge of this story. It is arguably the reason this remained one confrontation among several, rather than the moment this conflict crossed a threshold neither side could walk back from. Iran fired first, repeatedly, at commercial ships, at Navy vessels, at aircraft operating over the strait, and ultimately at 3 American-guided missile destroyers in a single coordinated attack combining every element of a doctrine 4 decades in the making. The Navy's answer every single time was fast, overwhelming, and completely one-sided. In terms of actual damage inflicted, 17 Americans dead, 427 wounded, thousands of civilian sailors trapped in a war zone they never asked to be part of, a blockade enforced daily with precision munitions and cannon fire, a ceasefire signed in April and tested almost every week through May, and 3 destroyers transiting a 2-mile shipping channel under fire, with every incoming threat destroyed before a single one reached its target. That is what the Strait of Hormuz looked like in the spring of 2026, and the question that matters now, the one that will define what comes next, is whether the pattern that repeated itself 4 times in 3 weeks is finished, or whether it is simply paused while both sides reload, rearm, and recalculate what it is going to take to actually end this. The water under that strait has already shown, again and again, exactly how quickly a ceasefire on paper becomes live combat in the space of a single ship's transit, and exactly how completely American naval forces have answered every single time Iran has chosen to test that line. Say the names of those 3 ships: the USS Truxtun, the USS Rafael Peralta, the USS Mason. They were in the narrowest, most dangerous stretch of water on the planet. Iran hit them with everything its doctrine had been building toward for 40 years. And the answer came back complete, immediate, and total. Not 1 hit, not 1 American casualty, just the wreckage of Iran's best coordinated attack and a retaliatory strike reaching all the way to Tehran. That is the Navy's answer. And Iran knows now, beyond any doubt, exactly what it costs to fire first.